Jewish life through about 200 jokes. And I came to understand at that time why ethnic humor is a controversial form of humor. Ethnic humor doesn't know individuals, it only knows groups. So if a joke begins an Irish guy, what's the joke going to be about? Drinking. If the punchline to a Jewish joke depended on a Jew being drunk, no one would laugh. Not because there aren't drunk Jews, but because the stereotypical image of Jews is so. If a joke begins an Italian guy, what's it going to be about? Likely it's not the mob. You know, Rodney Dangerfield said, I used to work in an Italian nightclub that was so tough on the menu they had broken leg of lamb. Where do Jews get it in humor? We get it in two ways, but they're both from the same area. One I don't understand, and one I do. The one I don't, they both have to do with money. The one that I don't understand is there are a lot of jokes depicting Jews as being cheap. I don't think that is a common Jewish characteristic. I don't think when Jews, a couple walk into a restaurant, waiters think, oh, we're not going to get a decent tip. The second is more interesting. It's Jews as tricksters. An enormous number of jokes. Now, a few things strike me as interesting about that. Number one, in Hebrew, there is no appellation, no term that's as honored a term as saying of somebody that so-and-so is a chacham, so-and-so is a wise person. But in Yiddish, the word chacham has actually the connotation of trickster, similar to the English wise and wise guy. So there's a similar notion. Now, what's fascinating to me is this. That joke, I'll tell you, I used to speak a lot on Jewish humor. People would say, do you ever speak before non-Jewish audiences? And I really have on occasion. And on it, they say, do you give the same speech? I said, the exact same speech. There's only one joke I only tell in front of a Jewish audience that I wouldn't tell in front of a non-Jewish audience. The joke is two Jewish businessmen run into each other on the street. One says to the other, I heard your business burned down last night. The other one says, shh, tomorrow night. Now, what's significant is Jews clearly wrote that joke. Jews laugh at the joke, and that joke has a serious point to it. In many areas, Jews have a very positive self-image. For example, if you hear of Jewish parents who don't care whether their son or daughter continues their education in some form beyond high school, we're shocked. There are such Jewish parents, but in our self-image, Jews are the most committed to education. If you hear of a Jewish man who divorces his wife and subsequent to the divorce maintains no contact with his children, we're shocked. There are such Jews, but our self-image is that we're very devoted to family, even more than other groups. If you hear of a Jew convicted of a white-collar crime, we're not shocked, we're embarrassed. In other words, in our own self-image, I'm not saying we're less honest, but in our own self-image, we're not necessarily more honest. The fact that 2,000 years ago, the rabbi said the very first question you're asked has to do with your business behavior, therefore becomes something very significant. By the way, in the Tosefta, which is one of the works, it's an expansion really of the Mishnah, so it doesn't have the same degrees of significance as the Mishnah, but it's a very important work of the oral law. There's a passage where they describe two types of stealing that are the worst types. What would you guess? I'm going to ask you. What would you guess the rabbis delineate as particularly evil types of stealing? One is, you know what, it's almost unfair to ask, we don't have really that much time. One is Chamur Gezel Goy, Gezel Yisrael, Mipnei Chilul Hashem. It's worse to steal from a non-Jew than from a Jew because you then defame God's name. You make the Jews seem terrible, and if you say, it's not fair to judge it, but think about it. How many of us at some point in our life have had a bad experience? I'm not saying this is fair or right, but how many of us in our life have had a bad experience with a member of a different ethnic or racial or religious group, and we made some ugly generalization or thought some ugly generalization about the group? And conversely, the opposite. We have a very positive experience. So you bring God's name into disrepute. The second is Chamur Gezel Harabim Gezel Yachid. It's worth to steal from the many than from the individual. Shagozel Yachid, because one who cheats the individual, Yacholafai so, can pacify him. Ulachzir lo Gezelo, and to return to him that which was stolen. Hagozel Harabim, one who steals from the many, Ein Yacholafai so, can't pacify because they don't even know who their victims were, as in a store setting. You can't undo the damage. The second text. This one, I think, is an important one, and it's interestingly not quoted that often. There was, in the Talmud describes an incident when Rabban Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, and the number 2 person in the Sanhedrin was Rabbi Yehoshua. And they had arguments. Gamliel, interestingly, though he was a descendant of Hillel, didn't have Hillel's characteristic sort of sense, had a very moderate, or more moderate disposition. Gamliel was a tougher character, and he was a bit autocratic, which you wouldn't think with Hillel. And Yehoshua was sort of the bleeding heart liberal. And I'm saying that, or maybe you could say bleeding heart conservative. He was a very good-natured guy. And they got into an argument. It was a technical argument. It had to do with the laws concerning Ma'ariv. And Gamliel publicly humiliated Yehoshua. And if you're familiar with Jewish sources, you know that publicly humiliating a person is a very bad offense, and public humiliation is a terrible offense. The rabbis got so disgusted that despite Gamliel's autocracy, they had the power to depose him. So they really deposed him. Gamliel was shocked. He didn't think they would ever do such a thing. And after a few days passed and he realized they really had done it, he realized that his only hope was to go and pacify Rabbi Yehoshua. So he goes to Rabbi Yehoshua's house. And Gamliel was quite a wealthy man, and Yehoshua was not at all. Kimata levete, as you might be aware if you study Talmud, it's hard because Talmud is a combination, it's Aramaic, an enormous amount of Hebrew, but most of us, I find, our Aramaic is a little rusty. Kibata lebeite, so when he came to Yehoshua's house, Chazina lashiata debete b'mishachara. He saw, I hope I'm not mispronouncing any of these words, but I'm relying on the fact that nobody else's Aramaic is so great. Okay, now so he saw that the walls of his house were black, and he says, "Mikotle beitecha," from the walls of your house, it appears either that you're a charcoal burner, or you're a blacksmith. In other words, both are jobs that pay very, very little money. Remember, in the Talmudic era, the rabbis did not earn their living from their rabbinical jobs. From their rabbinical work, they had other jobs, and so those who were wealthy could be wealthy and sort of be independent scholars, and those who were poor worked very hard. So how did Yehoshua respond to this statement of Gamliel? He said, "Oy lo lador shatar pernaso." Oy, chaval, how sad it is for a generation that you're its leader. For you know nothing of the troubles of the scholars, how they make their livings and how they sustain themselves. And then Gamliel finally had to beg for forgiveness on the grounds of the merits of his father, the merits of his family. Yehoshua finally forgives. I thought of this dramatic encounter many years ago during one of the periodic times when Congress was debating a bill to raise the minimum wage. And I remember there were those who argued against raising the wage, though they were well aware, when I was growing up, obviously the minimum wage in actual number was much lower than it is now, but it was generally assumed that if you were willing to work 40 hours a week at a job, you would have enough money to live. You would have enough money to have a spouse. You might even have enough money, hopefully, to raise children. Obviously, it wouldn't be at a high level, but the idea was that if you worked full-time, you should be able to earn enough money so that at some level you could support your family. And I remember in these recent years when there have been arguments over the minimum wage, the people who are voted are well aware that even a person who's willing to work honestly 40 hours, 50 hours a week for minimum wage are going to have a hard time supporting themselves, let alone supporting anybody else. I wondered how many of those who opposed raising the minimum wage for adults had ever visited the home or befriended a person who had to subsist on such a salary. So, you know, it's nice sometimes in a company if, let's say, the owner of the company invites, once a year, invites the employees over, you know, in the American setting, maybe for a Christmas party, or Jewish setting, Hanukkah or something. But it would actually also be nice, conversely, if they periodically went to the homes of people who worked for them and saw how they were living. That's what I would call a moral imagination. And the third issue I want to just speak of for a few minutes is the significance of paying on time, lo tasok, don't oppress, don't abuse.